Thank you so much for joining us today, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Claude.
So thank you for the introduction, thank you for the invitation, and thank you everyone for coming. So when I was invited to speak about Toulouse Lautrec, I really wasn't quite sure what my topic would be. And as I was trying to dig through my memory banks and come up with a topic that might be suitable for a lecture, I thought about this painting. This is a very unambitious, unassuming painting by Picasso, maybe around 1900, 1901, that inaugurates the Blue Period. Now, why was I thinking about this painting? I was because if you look at the figure to the left-hand side, who is washing herself in a tub, that is immediately reminiscent of the work of Degas, who obviously had a significant impact on Picasso, not only throughout his early years, but throughout a great deal of his career. This same configuration influenced Toulouse Lautrec, and we find that this kind of symbiotic relationship is something that lasts through even the entirety of Picasso's career until 1944. And if you look at the background of this painting here, you have a reference to a poster by Toulouse Lautrec. So this small, unassuming, unpretentious painting becomes a kind of locus through which we can close the circle in terms of the relationship between these three titans of 19th and 20th century art. And I thought that this might be, therefore, a suitable subject to look at Lautrec in terms of his relationship to his predecessor Degas and his successor Picasso. Now, you might think to have one image such as this to provide a panoply through which we can look at the relationship of all these artists has got to be a one-off. It's got to be an isolated incident. There can't be anything that might play a similar kind of role. Well, if you look at this image, another Lautrec of 1897, again something unassuming, a scene of everyday life, a woman who is cutting up fish to sell, a very bizarre image to the extent that what we see on the left-hand side seems completely divorced from what is going on at the right, and it might be some imaginary scene, the connection to what is taking place on the right-hand side remaining somewhat completely ambiguous. So the same kind of odd relationship occurs to the extent that the right-hand side of the image looks very similar to these laundresses by Degas. Although we are dealing with laundry rather than fish, you can see that the body language is strikingly similar, and the edge of the table has the same kind of perspectival recession. Going back to the other part of the painting, what's on the left-hand side, this is strikingly like this very late Picasso of 1955 of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza. So I thought maybe I was onto something, and that perhaps the interrelationship between these three artists and closing the circle might again be a suitable topic. Of course, I could have chosen something else, something I discovered very recently. I didn't know about this until I started preparing for this lecture, that there's a rock band called Toulouse Lautrec. I have to confess I haven't heard their music. From their appearance, I don't think it's quite the thing that's up my alley, but even so, I could also have tried to explore the relationship between Lautrec and popular culture. This is a poster for a film that John Huston directed in the 50s, based on the life of Lautrec, and José Ferrer is here, as you can see, in the leading role. I saw the film again just the other day with my wife. I'm sorry to say we really didn't like it very much. Somehow it hasn't aged very well, but that's just my opinion. You should go and make up your own mind. But the popularity of Lautrec is not something we could really sneeze at, from tea kettles to bags to socks. You can find his images on pretty much everything. His life has also been the subject of comic books, mostly in France, such as this one, and you can see that Lautrec is always surrounded by the ladies of Montmartre, with the usual lifting up of the skirt that is so typical of the images that he produced, so that he has seeped into the popular culture in a manner that even many of us could not have anticipated. And here, the Avengers, I think this is Scarlett Johansson, replacing La Golue in this wonderful poster of the 1890s. So I could have explored all of this, and I would have had, as this t-shirt may remind us, I would have had nothing to lose. But that's just not my specialty, so let's move on to something a little bit more serious. Here are 3 self-portraits by the artist in question. And of course, self-portraiture is a long-lasting tradition in art history where the artist looks at his or her reflection in a mirror, thinks about who they are, what is their function in culture and society, and how do they represent themselves? Do they represent themselves as types? Do they represent themselves as individuals? These are questions that we often ask. These early self-portraits by these 3 artists are striking to the extent that they engage in very little idealization, and the artist portrays very few props in order to tell us who they are. It seems that the looking or the perception of the face is quite often the most immediate, most powerful element. I'm also struck by how little finish exists in all 3 paintings and how they're all monochromatic. This interest in the self, this interest in physiognomy, also led these 3 artists to a fascination with caricature. And this is fascinating to the extent that it allows a kind of bridge between high art and low art, popular culture and something that is more highbrow. And this fascination with caricature is important to the extent that it allows certain aspects of a person's character or the physiognomy of their face to emerge very rapidly and in very sharp relief. And caricature is especially interesting in our case because it is something to which these artists subjected their own image to themselves. So we have a self-portrait by Degas, a self-portrait by Lautrec, and a self-portrait by Picasso. This betrays the degree to which these artists are interested in investigating their own features through caricature. A very rapid way of exaggerating features, and despite this exaggeration, it nonetheless reveals something fundamental about the face and its evocation of character. This is something, of course, that is not unique to these artists. Daumier and Hogarth were fascinated with caricature as well, so this is something that also intersects a broader context of the history of art. But if we look at our particular artist, the artist that I've decided to focus on today, this is a very striking image. It's called Criminal Physiognomies that Degas executed in the 1880s looking at criminals. And the assumption in the 19th century was that, well, maybe you can say something of somebody's character on the basis of the topography of their face. I don't know if you are fans of the masterpiece series Victoria, but you may know that the young Prince Albert is misbehaving and they are bringing him to a specialist who comes up with a skull, a representation of the human face, with all of the different aspects of the character of human beings located in special locations of the skull, and he's very upset with this. He breaks the skull, but this is something that was very much believed in at the time, endorsed as a point of view. Lautrec was a kind of a mutual or equal opportunity offender, shall we say. Here he represents, in this image of a trial, everyone through this particular lens. So it's not just the accused, it's also the lawyers, it's also the judges, it's also the military. Everyone is subjected to this kind of mode of representation that owes a great deal to caricature. If you look at these images, also by Lautrec, you can see that he's taking that initial image by Degas and pushing it to an extreme. Representations of individual characters that exist on the stage, are seen through this particular lens. The exaggeration of the physiognomy reveals the darker side of the human character. And Picasso did this as well. He had many acquaintances, actors, and he even subjected himself, as we see in this self-portrait on the right-hand side, to this mode of physiognomic exploration, which is remarkably exaggerated. I shall say also, as another point that will create a link between these three artists, that the representation of character is not only revealed through the typography of the face, the features, the exaggeration of expression, but also through the looseness of execution. As if the artist realizes that he can express his state of emotion not just in the topic, but also in the way he paints. The implication being that every person somehow paints differently, just as every person has a different handwriting. And so our character can be conveyed through that particular conduit, and no differently than it can through the subject. Another intriguing link between these three artists is not just physiognomy, but body language. And here are three representations, again, Degas, Lautrec, and Picasso, of beggars, of old women in a very dire state of distress. And you can see how the evocation of this distress is not simply in terms of the poverty of the setting and in terms of the facial expression, but also the body language. Look at how they're completely compressed into this very, very small area, and how the artist employs very, very much the same kind of pose in order to convey the emotion of the downtrodden, the marginalized, the individuals who are somehow separate from society. This is an intriguing comparison as well between Lautrec and Picasso, not simply because the artist is focusing on the downtrodden, on the marginalized, as I've said before, but again, look at the execution, how the rapidity of the handling, the way in which the crayon or the pencil is applied so rapidly adds to the degree and level of agitation. I also found this comparison to be quite compelling in terms of the street urchin on the left-hand side by Lautrec and this seller of tomatoes by Picasso. Look at the importance of silhouette, the importance of outline, the rapidity of the handling. And here, because Lautrec is very much interested in commercial publication, in making illustrations for books, there's an interconnection between writing and the image, which Picasso also seems to explore, à la belle tomate, meaning here the beautiful tomatoes, come and buy the beautiful tomatoes from me. This focus on the working class and the body language is also expressed in this kind of polarity between, let's say, the way Degas and Lautrec also represent laundresses. And here it's the body at work, the body taking up a heavy load, shifting the body in the other direction. The artist is paying very, very close attention to how the body behaves in everyday situations where a particular burden is imposed on the figure. And here on the right-hand side, Lautrec picks up the same subject, but obviously now the laundry has probably already been delivered. The lady is going back to the cleaners in order to pick up some more, so that the effect of the shifting of weight is completely, in a sense, given way to something that is more relaxed, somehow less urgent. But in both cases, here again we have the artist looking at the working class, looking at body language, looking how the body behaves under certain conditions. I found the image on the right-hand side by Lautrec also to be a kind of composite. Here is a woman before a landscape, and you can see factories with billowing smoke in the background. She wears an umbrella, or she carries an umbrella. We see her from behind, and I thought to myself, gee, this reminds me of something. And it reminded me actually of two images, which probably Lautrec combined in order to create his own. Degas' Marie Cassatt at the Louvre, where again she's leaning on an umbrella. Again, it's the idea of body language, the figure seen from the back, and the billowing smokes from the factory. Very unusual a set of images, but nonetheless something that Lautrec could have looked at very carefully. What binds both artists, again, is this idea of expressing emotion through an economy of means, very, very narrow range of color, and yet you can see the hand on the chin or the lowered shoulders and the cast down figure all represent a sense of melancholia, a sense of alienation, a sense of despondency. We see this also through seated women that are slightly more aristocratic, and we spoke a moment ago about execution, and you can see the rapidity, the sketch-like execution on the left. You see this again picked up on the right-hand side, and again, two seated women. You can't do a great deal with a body that is seated, but the collapsing, the compression of that body in this particular stance gives you again an impression that the artist is interested in alienation, in solitude, how the figure in a sense is divorced from any kind of backdrop or activity. Here's another striking similarity between Lautrec and Picasso. The hand to the chin in both images is strikingly similar. The engagement with the spectator, and again the very rapid execution, the strokes in the background that are as evocative of psychology and emotion as anything else. This image by Degas is also quite striking. It always, bless you, disturbed me to the extent that this figure is not just in a corner. He not only has his hands in his pockets, you can see how the facial expression seems again very, very acute, again very reflective of some kind of agitated mental state, but maybe it's the mannequin in the lower right-hand side, and this figure is an artist. You can see his palette and his brushes in the foreground, as if he is somehow disconnected from them. But this white shirt also reminded me perhaps of what the insane patients are wrapped in when they're tucked away somewhere. And I thought of this image by Lautrec, Le Fou, meaning the madman, a striking similarity between this interest in insanity, in individuals who are somehow, again, away from the mainstream. And many artists empathize with the insane, especially when their arts were criticized for being crazy, for being insane, for being completely outside the mainstream, and a kind of identification sometimes occurred between artists and the insane. And again, to close the parentheses between our three artists, Picasso, El Loco, the madman, was also fascinated with this same topic. Now, going from the insane to the cafe may appear a bit of a jump, but we will see that this interest in physiognomy, this interest in body language, this interest in alienation is again something that runs through many of the images that we will be looking at. Here is Degas' L'Absinthe, a couple represented in a cafe. Here is L'Absinthe, a very narcotic, addictive drink that was eventually outlawed because of the ravages that it seemed to have imposed on late 19th century culture, is a bit of like the crack cocaine of the period. But you can see how body language, physiognomy is again employed in this particular instance in order to express this sense of alienation. You have two individuals who seem to be on the fringes of society brought together in this way, although we don't know who they are, if they have any relationship to one another. The artist brings them together physically, but it's almost as if they were worlds apart psychologically. Look at this image by Lautrec. Again, the glass of absinthe is very clearly indicated on the right-hand side as it is on the left, but also pay attention to the way in which the artist has created this tilting or table tilted towards our space in such a way to separate the figure from the spectator. This kind of compositional device is typical Degas and was picked up by Lautrec very carefully. This is another instance by Lautrec, again, of two individuals meeting in a cafe, but what I'm really struck by in this image is how they seem to look away from each other. And this reminded me of this image by Degas. Again, this is not a public space, it's not a cafe, it's two individuals inside an interior. The title is probably not the one that Degas gave to the piece, Sulking, but it's appropriate to the extent that it gives you a sense of what the relationship between the two figures are. So body language, physiognomy, all of these are employed by the artist in order to get a particular point across. Gesture is also important, and here you have individuals who look at one another, who engage one another. This may be a high-brow individuals with prostitutes. Prostitution was a very, very widespread phenomenon in this period, and we'll talk about it a little bit in greater detail in a moment, but look at this gesture and this gesture by Degas. This is a figure who is saying, well, how much did he pay you, she asks, and she says, no more than this, pointing to the space between her teeth. So gesture, again, is as important an element as physiognomy and body language. It occurs again in Lautrec, La Buveuse. Here also the painting is sometimes called The Hangover. And we spoke a while ago about execution. And look at the looseness of these particular touches that are surrounding this figure. She's inebriated, obviously, and maybe this could be Lautrec's own attempt to create a visual analog to a sense where everything is in flux, everything is in motion, there is no stability. Maybe he's not simply focusing on gesture, on body language and physiognomy, but also employing touch, execution, in order to give you a sense of what it might be like to be inebriated in this particular case. Not forgetting our friend Picasso. Again, you can see that he is fascinated with the same topic. Again, the absinthe drinker. Again, the very same gesture of the hand to the chin. Again, this interest in caricature. And again, the looseness of the execution. And just to put yet another image in this particular fabric, one which is even closer to caricature, so you can see how all of these themes, in a sense, reinforce one another. The idea of the alienated figure at a bar, the importance and the frequency of drink as an accompaniment to this particular subject is something that is very, very poignant in the Blue period. It occurs over and over again, whether these are anonymous figures next to their alcoholic drink, a woman on a table, or even Picasso's own friends, such as Eugène Sabartès on the right-hand side. And again, we have gesture, physiognomy, body language, all of these things reinforce one another. I can't help but bring this image in as well, because we started this subsection of this section talking about gesture, and look at the hands. The way the hands create a wonderful ballet here. All of this in complete disconnection to the drink in the foreground versus the way in which the human figures come close together. But again, although they are physically in proximity, psychologically or emotionally, they may as well be worlds apart. We are now going to move on to another category, the stage. By the way, I should perhaps say, in the spirit of full disclosure, that for the sake of clarity, I divided this lecture into several topics, like body language, physiognomy, the cafe, the stage, etc. But there will be considerable overlap between them. So there will be connections. These categories are somewhat arbitrary and I think helpful, but by the same token, don't think of them as absolute. One of the things for which, of course, Degas is most famous is his representations of ballerinas, but it's fascinating to see the extent to which body language, again, is an important element, movement and how he's interested in how the ballerina behaves before the performance, and how the ballerina, in a sense, could be one ballerina in a succession of movements, or maybe different ballerinas. So we're not sure if it's one ballerina or different ballerinas, whether it's one in different moments in time or a succession of progression. The same thing happens to Lautrec. You can see that this is the troupe de Mademoiselle Églantine, and here we find all the ballerinas. Here this is popular can-can dancers rather than ballerinas, but just as we saw that somehow their tutus merge into a single unit, again making it difficult to know where one leaves off and the other begins, Lautrec employs very much the same strategy. What is of course prominent here are the legs, which were never shown in quite this manner before, which was extremely shocking, but even so you can see how the skirts merge together in a kind of homogeneous mass. This is something that Picasso picks up on again himself. The same is true here on the left-hand side. The inclusion of lettering is also, and we'll get back to that later in the lecture, is also a direct correlation to Lautrec's employment of the poster as an advertising form. And here we find in Picasso on the right-hand side this fascination with the can-can dancer, the exposure of the legs, and again the looseness of execution that we saw in the previous work. In this piece in particular, what is fascinating is again the merger of the skirts, something that we saw in Degas, something that we saw in Picasso, something that Picasso picks up on as well. Here's a detail of another Lautrec piece to show how the facial features in Picasso's images are strikingly like those of Lautrec just a few years prior to his own execution. This is another intriguing comparison. This is Jeanne Avril on the left-hand side by Lautrec, and a study of a dancer by Picasso on the right. And here the point of intersection is the extent to which the skirt takes on a life of its own. It's like an abstract amoeba shape that is imbued with a phenomenal degree of energy. So it's almost as if you have the dancer on the one hand and you have this independent force, this independent form that almost has a will of its own. And we find that Picasso again seems to recreate the same kind of effect, although I tend to think of this also as very close to a palette shape, as if the creativity of the dancer is connected to his own creativity as an artist. Of course, in terms of the dance, we spoke about Degas being very famous for his representations of ballerinas, the discipline, the remarkable training that is required to take a human body and impose this kind of pattern upon it is something that runs throughout his production, the lifting of the hand and of the feet in this particular manner. But this image on the left-hand side is rather intriguing. It strikes a kind of odd note in Degas to the extent that the features are almost a kind of caricature and the body type seems to be slightly different than what one would expect from a ballerina. And it seems somewhat reminiscent of this image by Lautrec. Here you have the kicking feet, but somehow there's almost a sense of making fun of the ballerina too, just as you are respecting the degree of control and discipline that she's imposing on her own body. Now, I thought about Picasso, and Picasso also has an image of a ballerina kicking her feet, although this is more of a historical representation of Salome, but he also had this kind of interest in caricature and making fun of the ballerina, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. I thought this was a striking correlation between the representation of the ballerina on the left-hand side, very, very rapid, and the economy of means that is employed by Lautrec on the right. Going back to the stage, and looking at how these three artists are going to represent the idea of the performance. One of the things that strikes us immediately about Degas is how he places us in the midst of the public. And he uses color and a spatial disjunction to differentiate the stage and its artifice from our own location in the realm of the public. This occurs in Lautrec also. At the circus, again, you have a differentiation between the foreground and the background. Are we with other performers? What is the connection between the background and the foreground? And Picasso does this as well, representing the stage from a distance, placing us in the midst of either the public or other performers. We're not exactly sure. So what these three artists are doing is basically looking at the artifice of the performance and shifting our perspective. We go from the stage to the public and to a particular space where we see both at the same time. This fascination, for example, with the public is immediately discernible in this comparison between Degas on the left and, of course, Lautrec on the right. Visitors at the MFA might think, of course, of Marie Cassatt's very famous image that you all know very well, but that's about 10 years after Degas on the left-hand side. So the idea of looking, the idea of perception is very intriguing here, and so is the idea of, let's say, the public also going to the theater, also going to a performance for themselves to be seen. And look at this really dramatic way in which Picasso has lifted his own image from Lautrec. By the way, Picasso is very famous as saying, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And as far as thieves are concerned, Picasso is up there with the best of them. So look at, again, the employment of caricature and body language, strikingly similar in both images, the very perspective and the use of the loge, again, and its differentiation from space as a dramatic sort of diagonal in both cases. And again, look at the rapidity of the execution, the looseness with which the artist creates the work, as if to also exacerbate our sense of immediacy. We have a sense that we're there, that we are looking at this particular scene with a great deal of authenticity and transparency. Here is another intriguing comparison, the way in which Picasso was fascinated with spectatorship, and he, in fact, probably was a closer participant in the theater than any of the other artists we're discussing, to the extent that he also designed sets for Diaghilev, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, one of the other fascinating things about the theater, about performance, about the stage, is the invention of these new artificial lights, gaslighting, or even electricity, which creates very, very dramatic disfiguration and discoloration of the face as it is lit from below. This is something that obviously interests Degas. It's something that's picked up by Lautrec, and it is something which also helps us explain, if you look at this image, one of the early ones that I showed you, many people were completely dumbstruck by these three forms, and were thinking that perhaps Lautrec was fascinated with anticipating abstraction, but if you look at their reappearance in the background, and if you look at other images such as these by Degas, it's obvious that these represent lamps, that they're not abstract shapes at all, only that Lautrec, in a sense, very concisely, with a great economy of means, managed to represent them in this manner. We find that lighting, again, distorts the representations of human figures. This is an image which obviously displays this to great effect. I wanted to also pay attention to these figures in the background. This is Lautrec depicting himself with a friend of his. You can see how similar this is to this double portrait of himself and a friend by Picasso, and even you can find this image by Picasso, again highly indebted to the one by Lautrec on the right-hand side. I had no place to put in these images, so I shoved them in here. I found this as an excuse, but the real point I wanted to make, before I so rudely interrupted myself, was the distortion of lighting that we had seen in the previous images that again is picked up in this particular painting painting of Lautrec at the Moulin Rouge. And again, this image that we saw by Picasso, again, you can see the distortion of this underlighting, distorting the features of the figures and changing their coloration to something highly artificial. This is an intriguing image also because you can see much of this lighting here, and now we see the stage from the vantage point of the performers. So these artists are exploring, again, multi-perspectives. They put you in the context of the public. They put you in the context of the performers. This is Degas. Again, Lautrec does this many, many times. And again, these particular abstract forms then give you an indication of what those shapes actually represent, that they're obviously lights. And we find Picasso involved in the same situation. The pulling of the curtain is a theme that reoccurs many times. We'll see that in a moment. And again, looking at the performance from the vantage point of the performer. This is another manifestation that is quite intriguing in this period, the café-concert. So now we're back to this idea of looking at the stage through the perspective of the public and how to isolate a number of figures from a mass. What we have is the artist using these strong diagonals against verticals and horizontals and identifying a particular couple for us as the spectator to focus on. You can see this in Lautrec as well. There's a mass in the background. There's an isolation of several figures in the foreground. And again, this dramatic diagonal and horizontal against which the artist is constructing his particular space. We find this in Picasso again. Again, one particular very, very dramatic horizontal, one diagonal, sets of individuals set in the foreground as opposed to this mass in the background. So the individual versus the group, the geometric construction, all of these are particular points that are of great fascination to all of the artists. One of the things that is also quite significant, and this began with Degas, is to take a very, very odd vantage point. Here we are looking we're looking at Miss Lala from below. Here we're looking at ballet dancers from above. And this radical cropping of this figure is again another point that these artists will look to as a model. So looking at things from above, looking at things from below, a different kind of orientation point. We find this in Lautrec as well. We're looking at this figure from below. We are looking at these trapeze artists from below as well. I'd mentioned that Picasso designed sets for Diaghilev. This is one example. This is for Pulcinella, set to music by Stravinsky, incidentally, in case you're interested. And we have, again, a representation of the public now within the set of what takes place on stage. So that blurring of what belongs to the performer, what belongs to the public, which part of the stage are we in, is again blurred, but the point I wanted to make is again seeing things from a low perspective and the distortion of perspective that takes place as a result. Here are other images by Picasso. Again, you're looking at something from above. Here's a performance to the left-hand side, 1901 and 1960. So Picasso was fascinated with these disjunctions in perspective throughout the entirety of his career. This is a fascinating image to the extent that the spatial disjunction now is occurring by means of the incorporations of the heads of these double bases. So again, the artist represents a schism in space and the intrusion into that space of something that belongs elsewhere. We find that Lautrec picks up on this immediately. Again, it's something that occurs very, very frequently in Degas. We're in the midst of the public space, we're looking at the performance, and this particular object intervenes between them. Here's another image by Degas, which does the same thing, and which is, of course, the very inspiration for this image by Lautrec on the right-hand side. Picasso does this too. Again, here is the double bass, picked up from Lautrec, who picked it up from Degas. By the way, both of these artists are not neither of these artists are representing anything realistic, to the extent that if any of you go to the symphony, you know that the double basses are to the right side with the cellos, not to the left-hand side as they are depicted here. All of which suggests that despite their look of realism, these works are always artificial and highly contrived. Speaking of contrived and artificial, and this is probably a stretch on my part, but I like the juxtaposition of the musical instrument and the sheet music, which Picasso did later during his synthetic cubist phase, which may have a connection with Lautrec or maybe not. We had mentioned a radical cropping that Degas liked to engage in very early on, and we find that these ballerinas rehearsing are all striking the same pose, and as we try to make sense of it, we then realize that this foot doesn't belong to any of the ballerinas here. It actually belongs to a ballerina that exists somewhere in our space. This very radical form of cropping was very, very revolutionary at the time, and some people attributed it to the invention of photography, but in fact you don't find in photography such a radical cropping of anatomy in this manner, and for this reason maybe Lautrec looked at Degas very much with this idea in mind when he created this version of ballet dancers where the hands emerge out of nowhere, just as these feet of the ballerina that we had seen in Degas' work. What's also fascinating about the stage, and again something that unites all of these figures, is the way they're interested in the acknowledgement of the spectator, or to the spectator, of the performer at the end of the performance. The implication is that there is an acknowledgement here of the artifice of the performance itself. When the willing suspension of disbelief is basically eliminated and the performer now says, I acknowledge the public, I acknowledge that you are here, and what you saw was a performance and nothing else. And here is Yvette Gilbert doing precisely the same thing, acknowledging, taking the applause from the spectator, and here we find Picasso doing exactly that. So this is an intriguing connection again between them, between these three artists, to the extent that the artifice of the performance is something that they bring to the fore. If we go back to this image, again, I was interested in the way in which the artist is making us look at the performance from the vantage point of the performer. Look at this figure here, who is basically following along with the text in order to, if in case an actor forgets their lines, they can give them a little heads up. And here you have the same thing in Lautrec, and you have the same thing in Picasso. So again, these three artists seem to be very, very much fascinated with the same kind of topic, the same kind of acknowledgement, and the dispelling of the illusion, if you will. So that we can say there's a kind of drawing of the curtain back to see what takes place. And as a theme, in terms of our interest in body language, drawing the curtain back relates Degas to Lautrec, and even to Picasso yet again. I'm also fascinated by this particular comparison, to the extent that Lautrec represents a figure with very, very few touches with makeup. And then he represents him taking the makeup away. I don't know if you saw the film The Cabaret that came out in the late 70s. There's a fantastic scene where Liza Minnelli is about to go on stage and her expression is extremely serious. And she just snaps into a smile, the curtain opens, and she goes on stage, which demonstrates, again, what happens behind the scenes and how the artist changes the performer in order to engage in the performance. And just as we saw, drawing the curtain being important themes, this occurs here as well. And we don't know in this Picasso figure whether he's behind the scenes, whether he's in his own dressing room. All of this is ambiguous. And so behind the scenes is an important element as well. Look at this Degas on the left-hand side, Lautrec on the right-hand side. Again, it's not performance, but it is a figure fixing her tutu. Same thing occurs on the right-hand side, and the artist is interested in that voyeuristic point of view. Let's look at what happens, not when the figure is performing, but when the figure is preparing for the performance. This is another fascinating representation, Degas on the left, Lautrec on the right, the body language that is struck by the performer behind the scenes. Again, you see that the discipline of the body, of imposing a kind of pattern upon the body's natural proclivity to move, is something that is still there even while the dancer is resting. And a point I also would like to draw your attention to is the background. How the artist employs, let's say, the brown of the paper to create an entire ambiance. Here's another fascinating representation of what happens behind the scenes. The two clowns sharing a moment of intimacy in Lautrec, and we find that for Picasso as well. That these people have an emotional life behind what we see behind the curtain, and this is meant to be represented as well. This is fascinating to the extent that the mother is an important figure behind the scenes, that she helps the dancers fix their costumes. You find this in Degas, you find this in Lautrec also. The mother is someone that accompanies the poor dancer while she has to await the results of an examination. She shares the anxiety, she shares the nervousness, and yet again, these two figures are very close physically, but they're also worlds apart psychologically, to the extent that it is one who has to perform and the other one has to wait. And again, look at the pose. She is no longer performing, and yet the imposition of the logic, the structure, the artifice of the ballet pose still remains upon her, as it does in these two figures by Lautrec. Meaning, even while they're at rest, the dancers strike the same pose. Where does performance leave off and the natural propensity of the body come in? This is another figure now by Picasso. You can see the compression of the body that we had mentioned earlier. The sense of anxiety and alienation is also something that pertains to performers. Look at this particular comparison, the anticipation of going on stage now. How do you prepare yourself? How do you prepare your body? How do you prepare your emotional state before you go and do your performance? This is something that both of these artists share, as does, again, the more mundane gestures of fixing your tutu, of fixing an article of clothing, rather than the actual performance on stage. It is those more mundane particular incidents that the artists adore. Picasso eventually married a dancer, Olga, in the 1920s, when he was very much involved with the ballet russe with Diaghilev, and so the idea of performance and rehearsal is also something of interest to him. And you can see this go back to Degas on multiple occasions. Again, the artist is rehearsing. Look at the poses of the feet, very strikingly similar between both images. But if you think back to that particular comparison I introduced earlier, that there's an interest in caricature, there's also an interest in ridiculing the performer, you can see this in this set of images again, where the body type and the facial features are not exactly what one would expect from ballerinas. Even though this tension between performance and rest, the natural body versus the body, in a sense, compressed into this artificial state of the ballet, is another dichotomy that Picasso shares as well. The circus was very important to both artists. Again, you can see the performers backstage preparing. This is something that we find in Degas all the time. This is, again, the idea of looking backstage. From that particular area, we see something that we're not normally privy to. This is a fascinating image, how the two, in a sense, give you the perspective of about to go on the stage from the sidelines. This is just remarkable how closely both artists are taking the same perspective and vantage point. And here, what is fascinating fascinating, of course, is how the body gets contorted. What do the performers do? They are on a trapeze, they in a sense hang upside down, and we find that Picasso loves all of these elements themselves, hanging upside down, hanging from a trapeze, and again walking in this tightrope. You have to see or think about the degree to which someone like Lautrec, who, as you probably know from his biography, was very fragile physically and could not do very much, he must have greatly admired these performers who were able to push their body to the limit, no less than the ballet dancers, and how this exaggerated their physiognomy and their body type, so that parts of their muscles were highly developed, other parts were not. And again, this fascination occurs with Picasso too. By the way, many people went to entertainment spots in France at this time. Entertainment was extremely popular, whether it's the stage, whether it's the circus, whether it's the ballet, whether it's the café-concert. All of these things were basically extremely popular with many members of the Parisian populace at this time. This may be another stretch on my part, but this, no pun intended, of course, but you can see this acrobat who doesn't have a torso as perhaps being another synthesis of these images. So the legs thrown back, the arms going downwards, the face also thrust in an uncomfortable position. It seems as though Picasso synthesized these elements from Lautrec and created another variation on the acrobat. This is another fascinating image from my perspective, to the extent that it's a representation of the circus, and you can see that the horse and the dresseur, or the figure who is taming the horse, are all created in very much the same manner. Of course, Picasso pushes this to an extreme, focusing on the baton and the string here, creating the entire piece out of a single line. So you can see the line here creates this entire figure, and the horse is also created by one continuous line. And you're wondering, well, what could this be? He cheated here, actually. Sure. But if you're wondering what this particular line, this bubble represents, Lautrec gives you a perfect clue. It represents the ring of the circus itself. So another way of connecting both images. We spoke about the degree to which Lautrec must have been intrigued with feats of physical prowess. The women who ride horses, side saddle, with very, very little protection, is something that he focused on a great deal in his illustrations of the circus, and Picasso did as well. You can see the same kind of theme, but there is something that divides Picasso from Lautrec, in that there is a sense of rigidity, a sense of discipline, a sense of almost oppression in Lautrec's images of the circus, and I will come up with a particular rationale for this in a moment. But before I get to that, I want to for us to pay attention to this image, where again now you have two horses on the left-hand side and two figures, and you have two figures on the Picasso image as well. And I would like to think that somehow Picasso was drawing our attention from the highly developed representation of the horse's head versus the empty background that he was drawing upon Lautrec when he did this very same image. But he decided to quit for some unknown reason somewhere in the middle. So this particular image, or this particular theme, runs throughout Picasso's career. Even some 5 years before his death, he still represents the woman on a horse as an instance, an example of physical prowess to the extreme. Now, if Picasso and Lautrec looked at the circus performer for their physical skill, they also looked at the performer from the vantage point of caricature that we had mentioned a moment ago, to the extent that there's a certain silliness to the circus too, the way in which this particular figure is trying to make the dog perform. And the dog seems to have a mind of its own, perhaps unwilling to participate in this spectacle. Find that Lautrec picks up on this immediately. And that kind of silliness is exemplified not only by the elephant, that is obviously sort of ill-suited to the particular stool upon which he sits, but also this dog saying, what do you want me to do? Why do you want me to do this? And this extremely brutal-looking individual trying to make the dog do something which the dog is unwilling to do. So there's almost as if the representation of the clowns, of the circus performers, bifurcates. There's one which praises the physical prowess of the performers, and another which in a sense makes them look ridiculous. There's another Lautrec here. This is a duo of clowns, Foutit and Chocolat, a male duo, white and black performers, and you can see the degree to which, again, this figure looks completely ridiculous. And this was something that Picasso noticed as well. Look at how this figure, completely oversized on a horse, draws attention to the way in which the circus is not always something to be praised, but also something to be ridiculed in these artists. And if you go back to Foutit and Chocolat here, look at how this image of a clown is caricature taken to an extreme. And we find this again in Picasso, in this figure of a clown, sort of later in his career, with this extremely phallic nose. So one finds again this bifurcation, but actually it should be a tripartite distinction. It's not just that Picasso and Lautrec praise the physical prowess of clowns or sometimes ridicule them, they also see them as tragic figures. And here we find an intriguing correlation between a painting by Degas, the Harlequin and Columbine, two circus performers, where the male now, although the Harlequin is usually a trickster and a very, very clever performer, here he's, in a sense, in the position of the supplicant, yearning for the affections of the lady who seems to be uninterested in him completely. This is exacerbated on the right-hand side, where the figure of the clown is practically praying to a completely indifferent woman. So now we have a more tragic, more melancholic representation of the clown. And if Lautrec often, in a sense, liked to dress up, this image of the clown can almost be seen as a self-portrait, precisely because this figure looks not just clownish, but looks like a dwarf. So this could be a kind of displaced self-portrait on Lautrec's part. We can say the same about Picasso, whose representation of harlequins and pierrots again lasts throughout his career, but this image is especially intriguing because it represents him as a harlequin next to a woman with whom he had an affair who caused the suicide of a friend of his. So there's a dramatic connection in Picasso's work with the harlequin and melancholia, and maybe with the harlequin and death. All of which, again, is to say that the representation of the clown has remarkable elasticity and plurality in the work of these three artists. This is another fascinating image by Picasso, because again it represents the strong man, who we've seen before, again it represents the lady on a horse, and this is a self-portrait by Picasso. And he was also very short in stature. So he is perhaps depicting himself also as a dwarf, also as a clown, also as somebody of very short stature. And if we go back to this image by Lautrec, look at how close it is to this image by Picasso. And again, we have the duality between the supplicant clown and the beautiful woman who basically has no interest in him and is, in effect, drawing attention to how small he is and how, in effect, he will never win her affection. So here we have another connection between Lautrec and Picasso. And again, both of them love to dress up, both of them like to dress up as clowns, as we see in this particular image, and the clown now becomes, again, an object of ridicule. In this particular image, again, the clown with the red nose seems to be completely besotted with this figure, as is this figure in Picasso, but the woman will pay no attention to him. This image by Picasso is also revealing to the extent that the old figure, the dwarf, is the artist himself. If this analogy was not persuasive before, it is here now because the artist is basically the clown and the clown is the artist. So when we think of these figures, this is basically the point that is being connected between both figures in Picasso and Lautrec. Now, I had mentioned before that there's a certain melancholy in Lautrec's work of the circus as well. And one should perhaps put these images in context to the extent that Lautrec suffered from syphilis, he also suffered from anxiety, depression, and was committed to an asylum by his family. His addiction to alcohol exacerbated all of these problems, and to prove that he was sane, actually Lautrec executed all of these images of the circus from memory to show his doctors that actually he was well enough to be released. But you can see in an image such as this that he is in a sense forced to do this for a particular purpose, and that he empathizes with the circus performer, and look at the dichotomy between the way in which these horses are remarkably elegant, and yet this figure is downtrodden, melancholic. We're going back to this interest in physiognomy and body language that we had mentioned before, and this could be Lautrec himself, forced to represent these images in order to prove his sanity to doctors, and using the circus performer as, again, a kind of surrogate self. If we look at this image, it's always struck me as somehow double-edged. Is this a clown with a horse? Are they representing something funny, something clumsy, or is there something more serious here? This image reminds me of these images of dead horses by Degas, or images by Picasso where the horse, in the context of the bullfight, is basically disemboweled by the bull. And of course we know that the horse plays a very, very important role in Guernica and in the sketches for that painting, where the horse becomes in effect the surrogate for the Spanish people who are being destroyed by Franco. So when we look at this image, again by Lautrec, we find a very disturbing quality. And as I was thinking about this lecture, I came across this piece by Lautrec, very unusual, a kind of illustration for tauromachia, meaning the bullfight. It's probably the only image in his entire production that deals with this topic and includes a skull's head, which of course is an extremely important theme in Picasso. Again, something very, very unusual. Who knew that this connection would occur? But going back to this image, again, we are drawn to this correlation, and we're drawn to the ambiguity in what Lautrec is trying to depict. Is this something funny? Is this something serious? Is this something melancholic and dramatic? Or is it simply a celebration of the circus? So speaking about horses, the horses are topics that were very close to the hearts of both Lautrec and Picasso, and in fact their very, very first images that we know of dealt with horses. This is a child's drawing by Lautrec, and again you can see a representation of horses, and the same about Picasso, although in fact the subjects are different in that, as we said earlier, Picasso is more interested in the bullfight, and Lautrec is more interested in carriages and horse racing. This comparison is fascinating to the extent that Lautrec also did this childlike representation much later in his life, and so did Picasso. So this interest in the child is very, very radical for two artists who are working now as adults. And Picasso very famously said at one point in his life that he worked very hard to unlearn everything that he had been taught, as if he wanted to, in a sense, draw like a child again. Of course, horses have a more serious quality. The horse in the stable, in Degas, again we find this in Lautrec. the horse as a very refined individual, animal, extremely sensitively bred in order to perform to the highest possible degree. And like a ballerina, the horse has to be brought under control. The natural propensity toward movement has to be trained so that all of its savagery, all of its animalistic traits have to be disciplined in order for the horse to perform in a particular manner. So again, Degas, Lautrec, you can see how remarkably similar their particular studies are. This is another fascinating image and comparison. I cheated by making sure that the background horizon would line up because, in effect, I always tend to think of the figure on the left as the preparation for the figure on the right. It's almost as if the horses are now, the horse and jockey are preparing for motion, preparing for the race, and this is the full engagement that we see on the right-hand side. So this particular comparison, I think, is instructive to the extent that Degas was fascinated with the preparation before the race, rather than the race itself. And we can look at these paintings for hours and see all sorts of connections. Look at how this, for example, line of one body of the horse meets with the other. Look at how we have an interconnection between different elements that line up perfectly. I love how this line meets up with the line of the sleeve and meets up with the line of the coat, again creating a perfect junction. This happens in Lautrec also. You can see how this line meets up with this line. This creates a perfect triangle. And again, the edge of the chin meets up with the horizon line and meets up with the collar of this figure. But again, we can spend hours looking at both images and pointing out all of these compositional alignment. But the point I wanted to make is how both artists are interested in the preparation before the race rather than the race itself. We see this again in this representation by Degas. We spoke about the horizontals and the diagonals and the isolation of an individual versus the group. This occurs in this painting. This occurs again in this particular drawing by Lautrec. And what is fascinating is Picasso picks up on this too, but Picasso moves towards the realm of the universal. He wants to leave the specific behind. He picks up on body language, he picks up on pose, but he moves away from the here and now to something a little bit outside of time and place. I found this fascinating comparison too between a Degas and a Picasso, but even if the Degas somehow is again strictly grounded in the idea of the horse race, this is something that moves in a completely different realm. Picasso does this on numerous occasions. Again, Lautrec is pulling the horse back to the stable, back to the paddock. Here we have a more abstract representation. Even though this is labeled the circus, the specificity of the performer's costumes, I think, are now moving into another realm. And I think more important than anything is this comparison, where again we are now, I didn't have to cheat this time, the horizon line lined up perfectly without my having to do anything. But what is striking is how the particular context of the image on the left yields to something, as I've said, more abstract, more universal. If we know where these people are going, if we know basically the context in which they are fulfilling their purpose, we don't know that in Picasso. Where is the boy going? Where is the horse going? And look at this completely desert-like landscape, which seems to demonstrate that somehow there's a greater sense of alienation and melancholy in Picasso. We see this in, these are not horses, these are dogs, but again you can see that the figure on the left is obviously an aristocrat, a young boy in a sailor suit with his dog, versus a very, very poor figure on the right-hand side. So if you look at this connection, again I seem to have mistaken the amount of time I needed to represent the connections between these three figures. But let me just go very quickly behind the last section of the representations of figures in top hats, male figures, Degas and Lautrec. Again, the fashionable lady and gentleman. In this particular case, the sense of informality in these figures. We see that in Lautrec also. And also a sense of melancholy, the downtrodden, seated figure, the clasped hands. We see this in Picasso too. So the fashionable gentleman has a certain sense of control, but there's also a sense of melancholy and isolation as well. There's a disturbing side to these figures as well. The oversized, pompous gentleman, full of makeup. Again, the red lipstick in both cases is a connection to them. But if you think about also the representations of women in the background, demonstrates that there's an odd relationship between men and women in this period, something that all three artists will be interested in. We go back here to the stage, but the point I want to make is that this figure of a man in the background seems to suggest that there's a relationship of power between men and women. That the upper class man and the lower class woman, which is represented as the dancer, somehow create a relationship of asymmetry and control, which is in evidence in some other representations, which depict the body language and the physiognomy in a manner that is far more direct. Look at the way these men have cornered these women, that those poor ballerinas have nowhere to go, and they're under pressure to succumb to the advances of these particular figures. Look at how, again, the human male figures are much more dominant, more controlling than the female figures. And if it is, in a sense, subtle in Degas, it's much more obvious in the representations of Lautrec, as we see on the right-hand side, that the employment of this gesture is almost one of extreme violence. We find the same representation in Picasso. Again, the man with the top hat. It's a self-portrait surrounded by naked figures, and I might end with this particular image, which is extremely satirical. Now, la belle qui passe, the beauty that walks past, and here now the males are themselves rendered naked, no less ridiculous than the beauty, sarcastically, which walks by. Thank you very much.
The Belle Epoque, and it's a period of intense gaiety and liveliness and social arena. And when you've drawn back the curtain for all the performers and circus performers, dancers, whatever, there's a curious lack of joy. There's a sadness, there's a sense of alienation and darkness to all these figures. I haven't seen anything that projects that kind of joyfulness and jollity that you would expect at this time.
Well, that raises the point as to whether that particular term, Belle Époque, is really quite accurate. It's more of a label than anything else, just as when, let's say, we say the Dark Ages, we say the Renaissance, and we think that one particular label encapsulates hundreds of years and basically labels and affixes an appropriate descriptor to a period that has remarkable complexity. They're poor, they're rich, they're happy, they're sad people. So those particular labels are really as artificial as anything else. I have to say that this was a period also of extreme anxiety in France, to the extent that this, let's say, between the Franco-Prussian War and World War I was a period of great technological breakthroughs, but it was also a period of great anxiety to the extent that France had just lost the war to Prussia and had to cede two of its départements, like a state, to Germany. So imagine if the States had engaged in war with Mexico and they had to cede Arizona and Texas to Mexico. You can imagine what kind of trauma it would have imposed on the general population. And so the French were suffering under this. Of course, they were going to recover those two départements at the end of World War I and imposed a very, very strong fine on Germany, which then caused great bitterness on Germany's part, which led to World War II, but that's a subject for another lecture. All of which is to say, basically, that any label for a historical period, like La Belle Époque, the Renaissance, or the Dark Ages, is nothing more than a gross overgeneralization. And these artists, Picasso in particular, was the poorest of the three in terms of his early career. Lautrec and Degas were basically sort of aristocratic and didn't need to earn a living the way most artists did. So you can imagine that they are secure financially, and yet they're fascinated with this other side of Parisian culture. And this is why whenever people think that Degas' paintings are just about ballerinas, they're really missing the entire point. It's not, of course, only about the idea of control and discipline and the difficulty of being a ballerina, but it's also those relationships of power between men and women. We're very sensitive to this in the Me Too era, but these sort of issues apply throughout time and space, and they were very, very acute in this period. In fact, in a great deal of literature of the time, you have ballerinas that come from the lower classes and that in order to sustain their existence need a sugar daddy, as we find in the images by Degas and Lautrec, to sustain themselves. So this was something that was part of an entire theme that was explored at great depth, not just by artists, but by writers as well. And again, it's sort of, to use the sort of cliche of pulling the curtain back, it demonstrates again that what you see is not what you get. But also, I want to say as a follow-up to your question, also with regard to something that I began to mention, how the circus performer is in many respects a surrogate for the artist. So the artists, in a way, empathized with these figures. They saw their own struggles in them. And the idea of control, let's say that we have a natural proclivity to move as human beings, but the ballet or the circus imposes very stringent discipline and an artifice on that particular natural propensity to move. That could be seen as art itself, because art has to look spontaneous, but it is extremely controlled, it's extremely contrived. My favorite quote of the entire history of art actually comes from Degas, where he said that there is nothing spontaneous about my work, that the creation of a work of art requires as much premeditation and forethought as the perpetration of a crime. That's really something else. That's phenomenal. I like Jackson Pollock too, but he said abstract painting, damn it, is abstract. That doesn't have the poetry of the Degas. So when we think of the performer, when we think of the ballet dancer, you can see Degas saying, my art is the same thing. It has to look as though it's executed on the fly, as instantaneous. But in order to give that effect, it needs to be highly calculated and highly controlled.
How well did they know each other, and what were their relationships like if they did interact?
Lautrec knew Degas. Degas paid no attention to him because, Degas was a bit of a snob. When the Impressionists asked him, would you exhibit with us? He said, no, he did exhibit with them, but he said, when they asked him, will you go and paint outdoors with us? He said, no, art is not a sport. So he had a bit of a detached quality about him. It was not always easy to be in touch with him on a personal level. But it's obvious that Lautrec knew about him inside and out. By the time that Picasso came on the scene, I don't think he had any personal access to Degas. That would have been impossible. He may have crossed Lautrec, but I don't know of any documented instances of them meeting, and by that time, Lautrec was pretty much, by the time that Picasso came to Paris around 1900, that's the end of Lautrec's life, and so I think they had very little chances to meet face to face. But, on the other hand, their works were extremely well known to one another. Degas probably didn't know about Picasso. That's also the tail end of his life as well. Lautrec didn't know about Picasso, but Picasso knew the works of both of them very, very intimately. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all so much.